Welcome to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. I'm John Charles, and today the Poison Pen is honored to have with us author Susan Meissner, whose new book is Only the Beautiful. It comes out in April. Before we begin today, for those tuning in, I would like to let them know that the Poison Pen does have copies of Susan's new book on order, and we would be happy to hold one for you or put one in the mail. Just give us a call or go online to the Poison Pen Bookstore. And now I'd like to welcome Susan Meissner.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It really is my pleasure to be here with you today.
We're delighted you could take time to visit virtually with us. I always like to start with authors because I think their path to publication, who they are as an author, starts before they were a writer. So what can you tell us about Susan and your life before you actually became published?
Yeah, that is so true that for a lot of us writers, it begins very, very early. My mom tells me that I was making up poems in the backseat of the car when I was 4. I don't remember that, but she does. And I think it was just my wiring is to create something out of words. And when I was little, when I couldn't write yet, I had to do it in my head. And then when I was in 2nd grade, a teacher sent me home with a little red journal to write my stories in. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it was later when I was older, much older actually, that I realized she didn't give anybody else a little red journal that day.
Wow.
I think she said, yeah, she had me like, wait, and she gave it to me because I was probably writing at my desk when other kids were on the playground or something. So I think I was meant for this. I didn't always know how to make it a part of my working life. I think for a long time it was a hobby, and I saw it as something that was for me and only for me, like therapy, like gardening or playing the piano or cooking. And it wasn't until my 30s that I realized, I think I was meant to share what I write with other people. And so I became a journalist first, writing for a newspaper. And then the itch to write a novel just wouldn't go away. And in my 40s, I finally gave it a try.
What was your initial path to publication like? Was your first book Why the Sky is Blue?
Yeah, that was my first book. And I wrote it not really knowing how to get into this gig. And it was scary. And I quit my job at the paper to write it, thinking that I needed to give it my all. And I salute those people that write their first book while they're still doing their day job. I felt like I just couldn't wrap my head around that. So I did quit my job to write it. And I didn't know if it was going to make its way into the world. I just knew I had to try. I didn't want to get to the end of my life wishing I had given it a go. And so it did get published. I'm so grateful. It was published by a very small publishing house. But for me, I think it was the best way to start out because I kind of didn't know what I was doing. And I kind of cut my teeth on those early books. I'm so glad there was a place for them in a very small universe then. And it paved the way for me to do bigger, better things. I think I write better now than I did then. And then I'm in a bigger ocean, if you will. The books have a place in a wider ocean.
A larger landscape, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What can you tell us? What would you like readers to know about your new book, Only the Beautiful?
Well, it's about a movement in history that's been all but forgotten. And like other things I've written about, I think some things that we experience as humanity, we ought not to forget. Because when we forget, we lose all the lessons that we learned when we went through whatever it was. And the eugenics movement was very popular in the United States in the early part of the 20th century. It was a movement to improve the collective gene pool. It was called race betterment. They actually unashamedly called it race betterment. And it was all about controlling who could have children and who couldn't, and all in the name of trying to make better, healthier babies. And so they were encouraging, the leaders, eugenic leaders were encouraging wonderful, beautiful people to have children, and not only discouraging those they felt were inferior from having them, but actually doing something about it. And so many, many thousands of people in state institutions all over the United States were forcibly sterilized. And back then, it could be for almost anything that was seen as a flaw. There was a term called feeble-mindedness. We don't use it now, but it was used as a catch-all term for anybody who either tested poorly or maybe had dyslexia, maybe didn't have a great environment for learning. And they were maybe living on the streets or living in poverty. Maybe they had resorted to criminality to survive. And these are the kinds of people that are sterilizing. Even epileptics and alcoholics were being sterilized.
And what's scary is that actually the Supreme Court ruled in favor of this.
Yeah, that I studied that case in its entirety. It was called Buck v. Bell. It was about Carrie Buck. And I did toy with the idea of writing her story, fictionalizing her story. But you know what? It was just too sad. It really was. She was a young girl of average intelligence. Her school grades before she fell into the web of eugenic thinking were average. She was not an imbecile, but she was targeted as one because for a lot of different reasons. Her mother was in an institution. She did live in poverty. She was a foster child. And she was the first person sterilized in Virginia under eugenic legislation. And they just didn't want people like her having children. She was pregnant at the time, having been assaulted by her foster family's nephew. That child was taken from her, given to that foster family. And then she was later released from that institution. Her daughter had died by then of a rare disease, but in any case, her daughter was dead. And she always wanted more children. And of course, she couldn't have any. And she died later in her 50s or 60s, having never had a chance to be a mother again. And I didn't want to tell that story. But yes, her case did come before the Supreme Court. They wanted to set a precedent for this. They wanted to be able to do this to many other people and not have it come back in their faces as being unconstitutional. So they had this case. Carrie Buck went to the Supreme Court. And if you read, there's a book it's called Imbeciles, and it's a book about that case, about how she was misrepresented, did not have a good lawyer. It was really all kind of railroaded so that they would get this precedent that would allow states to have the green light to sterilize people without their knowledge or consent. And I couldn't tell that story. So I wanted to tell a different one that didn't sugarcoat anything. The book has some really sad moments, but it also has, I hope, very powerful, hopeful moments. And so I fictionalized two people that aren't real, but what happened to them is the real deal. It really happened.
And one of your characters, Roseanne, is it? Is the one that gets institutionalized, and it's through no fault of her own. I mean, she's basically put in, and that shows you how scary it is, because it can happen to anybody. And it's her attempt to gain control of her life again.
Right. Yeah. Eugenic legislation did go by the wayside after World War II, when we saw what eugenic thinking looks like at its absolute worst. And you don't have to look any farther than Adolf Hitler to see how bad eugenic thinking can be. When you talk about having the perfect race of people, that was his ideology, and we know what he did.
Yeah.
Program. Yes, a lot of eugenic legislation was taken off the books. It was rescinded, but many states kept them on the books for years. In California, my home state, the eugenic laws were on the books until the late 60s, early 70s. And it wasn't until the 1990s that Governor Gray Davis, governor at the time, issued a formal apology. It was a kind of a defining moment in our history, and it's being forgotten.
Your other character, Helen, kind of takes the readers to the eugenics experience in World War II, as you mentioned. And I had read a little bit about one of the programs the German Nazi Party was doing, but you kind of brought it back into sharp relief about how all those poor families had their children pretty much just taken from them, and horrible things were done.
It's rather appalling. I didn't know about it. It was when I started this research dive that I found out much more than I had learned. I think we all know the horrible things that happen at those concentration camps. We know the names of those places, Auschwitz and Dachau and Bergen-Belsen and Mauthausen. We know those names, but who of us have heard of Hartheim Castle and Steinhof? We don't know those names. And because before Adolf Hitler built those horrible camps where so many people of the Jewish race perished, he had another campaign, and it was first to sterilize people that he didn't think should have children. We were doing that, so did he. And then the next thing he did was he rounded up disabled children and adults, anybody he felt was inferior or flawed, and he rounded them up and he killed them. it's appalling to say it, and it's appalling for you to hear it, but it's what he did. And so that was kind of the precursor to those concentration camps. And yet few of us know about it. And I feel like if we're going to remember the mistakes of the past, then we have to, we kind of have to look at them and internalize them to the point where we don't forget what happened when we let eugenic thinking run unfettered. This is what happened.
One of the other fascinating things about your character, Roseanne, was, and correct me if I get the term wrong, is she has synesthesia?
It's a hard word to say. It's synesthesia.
Okay.
Synesthesia. And I knew about that condition before I wrote the book. A friend of mine actually has this condition, but what it is, it's neural, it's in the brain, and it's a tangling of the senses. So for some synesthesiacs, they will hear a sound and see color, and others will taste something when they hear a sound. And so it's like the senses overlap in the brain, and you have like one stimulus activating the response of a different one. So you might have an auditory stimulus and have a vision response, which is it's not usual. It's an anomaly. It wasn't understood at all in the late 20s, early 30s, which is when my character becomes a target for eugenic thinking. And of course, then it was seen as a gigantic flaw. And it is hereditary. It does show up in families. Not every child will have it if a parent has it, but it has some hereditary characteristics to it. And so it is seen as a flaw to be removed and definitely not to be passed on. The thing about synesthesia is, as different as it is, and it's hard for us to imagine what it might be like to hear a doorbell and see red triangles. But for synesthetes, for them, it's normal. That's how it's normal for them to have that happen. And I interviewed a number of them who told me it's beautiful. It adds depth and dimension to their lives, and they kind of feel sad for other people who don't, hear a rooster crow and see yellow, dots. And it's not like they see them out in front of them. They see these colors in the periphery of their mind. So I mentioned this in the book, like if I tell you to picture a running horse, you see it you can see it. I know you can see it because we're built to for the power of suggestion. And so, but they don't need anybody to tell them, see yellow triangles. It happens when they have an auditory stimulus. And most of them told me that it was difficult in school to pay attention because there's so much going on. And for a lot of synesthetes, numbers and nouns all have a color assigned to them, which is difficult for us to understand. But a synesthete might say 7, the number 7 is red. And so for a child who is a synesthete to see the number 7 written in blue, that can be kind of hard for them. It can be like, nails on a chalkboard, and we don't understand that, but that's how it is for them. And most of them told me they would never want to not have that condition. Partly because they've always had it, and partly because it has added such beauty to their lives.
Let's talk a little bit about how you do your research for the book. You've touched upon that, but also as an author, how do you strike the right balance in historical fiction between incorporating the period, bringing the reader into that world without it seeming like a history textbook? And one of the things that I love about your books, and I found it in this book too, was you have those little details that kind of you catch and it sets you there. Like you talk about the vineyard, which is the opening part for the story where Roseanne works, and how they survived the prohibition because they sold wine to the Catholic Church, which was a little detail that I just found fascinating. And you just kind of slip those in, so it sets you into that thing, but you don't kind of swamp the whole story with too many details. So how do you strike the right balance? What sources do you use to give you the sense of the time period?
Oh, thank you for that. It is a delicate, it's like surgery, because you're having to take out things you would love to put in. And in the end, you have to decide what moves the story forward and what is just a gee whiz fact that I found that I want you to know. And For me, I have to think, if I put this into the story, is it going to be, I want you to know this because I found it in research. Is the reader going to pick up on that I've just dropped in a tidbit for you, the reader, from me, the author? And if I do that and you sense it, that's author intrusion. I've just intruded on your reading experience and made myself known to you. And as an author, we're never supposed to do that. Author intrusion is a bad thing. We're supposed to be so invisible that you don't even know you're reading my book. And so when I start loading you up with wonderful historical details that don't move the story forward, that's usually what happens. And I've seen it in books that I've enjoyed up until that point where I thought, oh, I see the author now. I see you giving me information that you have found during your research. And it can be subtle, but I think the reader picks up on it because they start to get bored and they start to lose interest and they start to wonder, when are we going to get back to the story? So part of it is just being in tune with the story. And part of it is knowing the weight of what you've got. And I've got lots of information that I didn't use in the story that I put in and had to take out because I could feel that it was me. It was my presence bringing in information that did not move the story forward. Now, did that little tidbit about selling wine to the Catholic Church move the story forward?
Yeah, because I thought that's how they survived.
That's how they survived. And that winery in the vineyard where Rosie works, it survived because the prohibition because of that. So I thought in that respect, it moves the story forward. But you're right, it's delicate. And I always have to come back to, what does the story need? Not what do I need to impart, but what does the story need to move forward?
You had written something towards the end of the book, and I want to get it right because I wrote it down because I thought it was really so eloquently put, and it kind of sums up, I think, your purpose in writing this book and perhaps others. What you had written was, a book is always many places at once, that it is a singular wonder. A book takes one voice speaking and makes it many. A book can shine far brighter and longer than I ever could on my own. Mm-hmm. That's kind of why you wrote this book.
I think that was a way of giving books, I guess, their due. And I do feel like the themes, and if there's a message to this book, you can call it that, or you can just call it the takeaway, I guess. I do feel like it needs to be amplified because there are things about us that don't change year to year, decade to decade, century to century, millennia to millennia. Yeah. And that is that we tend to prejudge. Prejudice it seems to be pervasive, and we can't seem to quite rid ourselves of it. We tend to prejudge. Mm-hmm. And I feel like just because the eugenic movement is no longer in place and eugenic laws have pretty much disappeared, that doesn't mean we've stopped prejudging people or deciding that I'm better than you. And I decide what better is. Those two things are still sadly with us, and we see it all the time here in the 21st century. And it's probably something that we just take with us generation to generation. And because we do, we have to be mindful of it. We have to. There's a great quote by Mother Teresa, and I just love it. And she said, if we judge people, we have no time to love them. And I think, isn't that a great quote? I think it kind of encapsulates how destructive prejudice is, because it keeps love from flourishing. And love is what we need more than anything, especially now.
Yeah, you're so right about that. And for those tuning in, lest they think that the book is just a complete sob fest, it's not. I mean, granted, you probably might need Kleenex at a few points. I know I did, but there are some very hopeful messages woven into the story, especially with Helen's determination not to just let things happen, to do whatever she can on a small level to affect change. And was her efforts to kind of spirit children out of Vienna to safety, was that based on real accounts, real stories?
I never found one singular individual who did that. I wanted to be able to find someone and kind of mirror their story and then acknowledge them in the acknowledgements. I could not find that person. I feel like it still happened though. I want to believe that it happened. I just couldn't find evidence of it. I do know there were some Catholic charities that were working to try and help, but I could not find an individual, and I could not find like a singular moment where we have bona fide evidence that it happened. But like, again, I wanted to believe that it happened, and why shouldn't it have? I feel like it could have, it should have, it probably did, but I could not find that person like Helen who did what she did.
They were probably so good at it that we never really knew what they were doing. They just affected change.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. And I think, the stories we hear about World War II are the resistance people who hid Jews, like the people who hid Anna Frank and her family. And those stories definitely need to be told. And Corrie ten Boom and what happened with her and her family in Holland as well. And so, and obviously those stories, I want them told. And I think it's just because there are so many stories of people doing heroic things then that we just haven't been able to hear them all. And this might be one of them.
It's true. You've written a number of books before Only the Beautiful. Your last book, When We Had Wings, was rather remarkable too, in many ways. It was not a solo effort. It was an effort you undertook with a couple of your fellow authors. Can you tell readers a little bit about that book? Because it was also a very powerful book that kind of shined a light on a moment of history many of us are not familiar with.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, that book was a team effort between myself, Christina McMorris, and Ariel Lahan. They're good friends and fellow historical fiction authors. And we had this idea to bring the story of the military nurses who served in the Philippines during World War II to light, because it just seemed like it was another World War II story that just hadn't had enough light shown on it. And these women were so brave, and they're real people. There are almost 100 of them. Most of them have passed away now, but they were Army nurses and about a dozen Navy nurses and some Filipina nurses working for the American Army in Manila when the Japanese bombed it and then occupied it for 3.5 years. And so they became the first uniformed female prisoners of war. And even though they were prisoners of war, just like the male counterparts, they still did what they were sent there to do in the first place, which is take care of people. So they're nursing in terrible conditions in prisoner of war camps that you wouldn't believe how austere they were, and the depth of the deprivation that they went through, and still they were nursing people. They're amazing women. And we just wanted to fictionalize their story so that they too don't get forgotten.
I understand from what I've looked through, almost everything you've written is historical fiction. Is that correct?
I kind of joined the historical fiction brigade in 2008. My earlier novels, a lot of those are out of print now, and that's okay. They were my fledgling stories.
Did you write a mystery series?
I did. That
That's
was really
great.
fun, and you can
Yes.
listen to it on audio, and I believe you can read it electronically. The books themselves are out of print. So there were 3 mysteries and I think 7 just contemporary novels. And then I wrote The Shape of Mercy in 2008, which was a blending. It was a dual timeline novel based in the here and now, and also during the Salem witch trials. And I loved how that story came together. It was the most critically acclaimed of my novels to that point. It won several awards. And I thought, this is probably my lane, and I just didn't know it. And so I never looked back. I've been writing historical fiction since 2008.
What is it about history that draws you in as a writer?
I think what it does is I love to travel, and historical fiction takes you places, and it takes you places you can only go through the pages of a book, because I would have loved to have seen Florence during the time of the Renaissance. Well, I can't. I've been to Florence. I love Florence. I'd go back in a heartbeat. But when we go now to Florence, it's the Florence of today. It is not the Florence of the Medici family. But books can take you there, and books can take you to the Salem witch trials, and books can take you to the Philippines during World War II. And the eugenic movement, which not all of it was terrible. And so I think historical fiction has a kind of a special place in the literary world, is that it can take you places you can only visit that way.
Let's talk a little bit about your writing process, because you've been both a professional journalist and now a professional novelist. And I wondered if your journalistic training ever kind of bled into your fiction writing. You had written something else somewhere, and I thought it was really interesting. You said, what writing real stuff as opposed to fiction did for me more than anything else was open my eyes to the depth, width, and intricacy of the human quilt. By that, I mean, just like a quilt is made of many little pieces, the world is a big place full of lots of different people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really grateful for my 10 years as a journalist for a very small community newspaper. We did everything. It was a weekly paper, small staff. We wrote all of our own stories, took our own pictures, laid out the paper ourselves. And so it was really, I saw it all from the standpoint of a journalist working for a newspaper. And I did a lot of human interest stories because people love those. And so I got to meet a great many people, even in that small little town in Minnesota where we lived. Everybody has an amazing story to tell. And some people, you just get the opportunity to tell it. And so that opened my eyes as to how many people have something that should be told, their story should be told. And then I also learned how to hook a reader. Readers, even especially now, they have busy lives. There's a lot going on. There are many forms of entertainment, and books don't have to be one of them. And so for a lot of people, you've got to really invite them into the story right away in a good way, such that they want to then spend that time with you in the book rather than watch Netflix or do something else. And so I'm grateful for the journalistic idea that you've got to grab them in that first graph. You've got to hook the reader right at the beginning if you want them to stay with you, and especially if you want them to go to the jump. A great article will start on one page and then it jumps to another. And is that reader going to take the jump? Well, you want them to. And is the reader going to keep reading your book? Well, you want them to. And so that all of that training helped me, I hope, write a better book.
I think it did. You have been writing for a long time. If you thought about it, what has surprised you the most about the business of publishing as an author? And what would you, if you could, go back in time and tell yourself when you were first starting out as a writer? What advice would you give yourself?
Well, that's a great question. I think I thought that the more I did this, the better I would get and the easier it would get. Because I figured that, well, an Olympic swimmer starts out like everybody swimming laps in a pool, but the more they do it, the stronger they get as a swimmer and the easier it is to swim a mile. And so I thought, well, it's going to be that way too for me, right? But it's not. And I think it's because I don't swim the same mile. It's always a different mile when I start a new book. And so I start with nothing. I've got experience, sure. And that it's nice to look behind me and see titles. I've done this before. I can do this again, because there are many moments when I'm starting a new book where I feel like I'm a hack. I don't even know what I'm doing. And I can look back behind me and say, no, you've done this, you can do this, but it doesn't get easier at all. And I'm okay with that. I think the fact that it's still hard makes me reach, and it makes me want to write a better book than the last one I wrote. And I think that ends up producing for readers a better story. There's no time for complacency or resting on laurels. And that's probably a good thing. So I think I would go back and tell myself, hey, just so you know, it doesn't get easier, but you can be a better writer. And you do know what you're doing. And yes, there are going to be many, many days where you don't feel like you know what you're doing. But just stick with it, because in the end, you will complete the book you want to write. You will.
That's great advice. Let's talk a little bit about Susan as a reader. You're a writer, but you're also a reader. Do you gravitate towards historical fiction as a reader? Do you find other genres appealing? What are some of the books that have kind of been touchstones in your life?
Yeah, I do gravitate towards historical fiction, and part of it is probably I can't separate my personal life from my working life. I want to, but I don't think I have to. And I think it's okay that they intersect. And I was listening to an interview by Kate Morton, who I adore.
Oh, yeah.
I love her books, love them. And she has a new one out, just came out on Tuesday. And I was listening to an interview where she said they are interwoven, and she didn't apologize for that, that her personal life and her reading life and her writing life it's all melded together. So it's okay. I don't think I need to worry about that. That I read historical fiction because I know it's going to inform me as a writer. I still enjoy the journey. And so one of my favorite historical novels are Kate Morton. She's I'll buy anything she writes. And Anne Patchett the same way, Geraldine Brooks. If Geraldine Brooks writes a book, I'm going to get it. And recently, Jamie Ford's The Many Daughters of Afong Moy. I just loved that. And Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is a blend of historical and futuristic. So those are like my favorite books lately, and Horse by Geraldine Brooks. And I think those types of books inform my writing in that I read them and it makes me want to be a better writer. And I read them and I'll read a sentence and it's just beautiful. And I know the writer in me will stop and read it again to try and parse it. That's okay. It is okay, because I've still loved the book, but it makes me want to be able to do that same thing, is to give my readers that same experience. And so I do enjoy other genres a lot, actually. I loved The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which I'm not even sure how to describe what that book is. It's speculative fiction, I guess, but I loved it. I would read it again. And Life After Life by Kate Atkinson, I would read that again. It's also speculative fiction with historical wrapped up in it. And I love Louise Penny. I love Inspector Gamache and Everybody in Three Pines. And if Louise Penny writes a book, I buy it. So I enjoy other genres, but do I read them as much as I read historical fiction? No, I'm always grabbing historical fiction.
How can readers learn more about your books? Are you on social media? Do you have a website?
Yeah, my website is just SusanMeissnerAuthor.com. And I'm on Facebook at Susan Meissner. I'm on Instagram as Susan Meissner Author. And I'm on Twitter too every now and then. But I think I spend the most time on Instagram and on Facebook, Susan Meissner, because I feel like that's where my people are. I feel like my readers are also on those platforms. And so I feel like that's a place for us to meet, is on Instagram and Facebook. And then I have a newsletter that's easy to sign up for. I only send it out 4 times a year. And that's another way of reader and me being able to connect with each other.
I know your book just came out this month, Only the Beautiful, and it's perfectly fine if you don't want to answer this question, but can readers hope for something new for you in the future? Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, I can say actually 2 things. One is I've written a children's book, and it was,
wow.
I know, it was so fun and so different for me. I've always wanted to do it, like for years, never thought I could or would, because that's not what I'm known for, but an opportunity came my way. And so it's called Pumpkin Day at the Zoo. Oh. And it's it'll be published by Thomas Nelson Books in July. And it's got gorgeous illustrations from a fabulous children's illustrator, Pablo Pena. And I just love the book. It was written in verse. My favorite kind of children's book is a book written in verse. And it's about this day in usually October, where zoos all over the US give their animals pumpkins for an enrichment exercise and recreational thing for their habitats. And so that comes out in July, and it's I mean, you can pre-order it now if you want to, but it comes out in July. And so that's something I can tell you about. And then my next novel, I'm just writing it now, and it's very gauzy. It just feels like it's up in the clouds, and I'm still trying to pull it down. But I can tell you that it's early Cold War. It's 1956. And, you know, after the war, we all wanted to live. I wasn't alive then, but I can tell that everyone wanted to be happy again, and we wanted peace, and we wanted to move on from a terrible worldwide catastrophe that was World War II. But of course, it wasn't a time of great peace. It was not a time of violence anymore, but it wasn't peaceful. The Cold War was real. McCarthyism was real. The Red Scare was real. People were afraid of the bomb. It was kind of a scary time for people. And there were also 1 million people who were displaced by World War II. And so it's a story about displacement, about
Yeah.
what it feels like when you're not able to go home. Like the place you've always been and felt most comfortable is not available to you anymore. And for some people, that's a real place. Like if you were displaced, if you were an Eastern European displaced, that's physical, it's geographical. You can't go home. There is no home, or it's not safe to go home. And for other people, it's more of a mental thing to be displaced. And so anyway, that's the theme, is displacement, when it feels like you can't go back home because either it's not there, or mentally it's not a place you can return to. And so I don't have a title yet, but it's coming along, and I've got some time to figure it all out. It'll probably come out 2 years from now.
Oh, great. Well, I can't believe how quickly our time has just flown right by. We've been very fortunate at the Poison Pen to have author Susan Meissner with us today, whose new book is Only the Beautiful. I'd like to thank Susan for taking time to chat about her new book and her other projects. And I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in to another virtual author chat at the Poison Pen Bookstore. Thank you, Susan.
Oh, thanks for having me so much. It was just so much fun to talk with you.
Thank you.